Good morning. Today we are going to start the exciting book of Daniel, and there's going to be a lot of background on this first, and then we'll get into the actual scriptures. But my references are David Gusick, he's my main reference, Sir Robert Anderson, Gleason L. Archer Jr., Royce G. Baldwin, Albert Barnes, John Calvin, Adam Clark, W.G. Hessop, H.A. Ironside, Alexander McLaren, F.B. Meyer, G. Campbell Morgan, Philip R. Newell, James Smith, Charles Spurgeon, Lehan Strauss, Lewis R. Talbert, John Trapp, John F. Walford, and Leon Wood. So I have a lot of commentaries. The Enduring Word is the translation that I use. So Daniel, like Ezekiel, was a Jewish captive in Babylon, and he is of royal or princely descent. He was trained for palace service, and in the polluted atmosphere of an oriental court in Babylon, he lived a life of piety and also usefulness. Now, his long life extended from Nebuchadnezzar all the way through to Cyrus. He was a contemporary of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joshua, who was the high priest of the restoration, and Ezra and Zerubbabel. Daniel is the indispensable introduction to New Testament prophecy, and the themes of which were the apostasy of the church, which he didn't get into that, but the rest he did, the manifestation of the man of sin, the great tribulation, the return of the Lord, the resurrections, and the judgments. Now these were his themes. But Daniel is distinctively the prophet of the times of the Gentiles. And his vision covers the whole course of Gentile world rule to the end in catastrophe and to the setting up of the Messianic kingdom. So Daniel's in 4 divisions. 1, the introduction, which is the personal history of Daniel from the conquest in Jerusalem to the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, and that's all in chapter 1. And then the second section is the visions of Nebuchadnezzar and their results. This is chapters 2 and 4 through 4. Third is the personal history of Daniel under Belshazzar and Darius, and that's in chapter 5 and 6. And then 4 is the visions of Daniel in verse 7 through 12. And this, the first 6 chapters concern the life of Daniel, and then chapters 7 through 12 talks about fill-ins in those first 6 chapters. So Daniel lived in the 6th century before the birth of Christ. Now, the book of Daniel is a target of critics who doubt that Daniel described in the book who actually wrote the book, especially in light of the book's prophecies. So the book of Daniel claims to have been written by Daniel himself, and the fact that it's written mostly in the third person does not contradict that, because a lot of the prophets wrote in the third person. And the only place there's exception in Daniel is Daniel 8:1, 9:2, 9:20, and 10:2, just 4 verses that are where he speaks, I, Daniel, and then he goes on to finish his sentence. It's customary for ancient writers to write in the third person. The only one that did not write in the third person was Nehemiah, and he made it like a personal diary, and so it was in first person. So even God switches between the grammatical first and third persons in the scripture when he's talking about himself. In Exodus 20, verse 2, he says, I am the Lord your God. And then in Exodus 27, he says, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless. So the first time we see it in first person, the second time in third person. Now, Jesus took away all doubt on the matter. He told us that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. So who has Matthew 24:15? Does Kim have that maybe?
Kim.
Okay.
I think she does.
Could anybody get it real quickly for me? I tell you right now, who has Mark 13:14? That's next.
I have that.
Okay, read it and then we'll get to the other one.
Was it 24:15?
Yes. Go ahead, Ronnie.
Is Jesus, wait a minute, 13, 14.
13:14.
When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains.
Okay, and read Matthew 24:15.
It almost says the same thing.
Okay.
It says, when therefore see the abomination desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let him that readeth understand.
Okay, so both of these scriptures by Jesus said Daniel wrote Daniel. So the book of Daniel predicts events in the 2nd century. He's living in the 6th century. He predicted 2nd century before the coming of Jesus, especially the period of 175 through 164 BC. And it was so precise in his predictions, they came true so precisely that others say that he just could not have written it. It could not have been that precise. And then they want to put the date of Daniel in the years of the Maccabees, and this was between the Old and New Testaments. So supposedly the purpose for writing Daniel at that time was to inspire the people onto victory during the Maccabean Wars that they had. And the first recorded suggestion for a Maccabean date for Daniel, which is after right before Jesus, was by the Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyrius of Tyre, and that was in the 3rd century AD. And he said he couldn't believe that the prophecies that were given before they ever happened, and they had to be at a later date. Now, Jerome, who is someone who wrote about the arguments here, he says that these were actually commentaries of Daniel. So there's someone else that says Daniel actually wrote the scriptures. So then there was an influence by Enlightenment philosophies. We have people who are enlightened, in their findings. And they began to revive the old Maccabean date theory about the book of Daniel. And there was consensus among many of the academics that every accurate prediction in Daniel was written after it happened, because he couldn't have known all these things. And then there's a modern argument for late dating of Daniel based on supposedly inevitable mistakes that they found in the writings in the 2nd century BC. And they say a 2nd century BC writer could make these mistakes, but Daniel shouldn't have made them. And here were the mistakes. 1, the date of Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Judah. Number 2, the using of the word Chaldeans to describe a class of soothsayers. Number 3, the account of Nebuchadnezzar's madness. 4, King Belshazzar and his relationship with Nabonidus. And 5, the figure of Darius the Mede. So there is also an argument made against the book of Daniel, claiming that certain Greek words were used in the writing in Daniel, and those didn't really come into the Hebrew vocabulary until the 2nd century. Now, from Daniel 2, verse 4 through 7:28, the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. And this is the ancient language of Syria, but it's almost identical to the language of the Chaldeans. And so upon this fact, together with the occurrence of 15 Persian names and 3 Greek words found in Daniel, we favor the argument for Daniel writing them, because he was in the court of the Babylonians and they had emissaries coming from all over, and they would be the Greeks and the Persians. So it seems that some modern exceptions to the Hebrew and Christian scholarship of the ages, the unanswerable proof, rather than the Daniel authorship of the book, that living from boyhood, from the time he went to Babylon, he knew the language of the Chaldeans, and that's probably what he used, which is so similar to Syria that they called it the Syrian translations. So you choose what you want to believe, is what I say to you this morning. I'm going to choose what Jesus said. Jesus said Daniel wrote it, and I'm going to choose that one. You can choose some of the others if you want to. So now let's get into Daniel, part 1, which is an introduction to the personal history of Daniel. In chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shemar, into the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Now Jehoiakim was a Judean king, and he was placed on the throne by Necho II, who was the Pharaoh of Egypt. And his name means Yahweh raises up. But of course the Lord did not raise him up at all. Pharaoh did. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of Babylon at that time, and the name Nebuchadnezzar is a Hebrew transliteration of the Babylonian name Nebuchadnezzar, which is a long name, but it means Nebu protects the crown. So Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem because the Pharaoh of Egypt invaded Babylon. And so in response, this young ruler, Nebuchadnezzar, defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish, and we've talked about that a little bit before. And then he pursued the Egyptian army all the way back down to the Sinai. And along the way, or either on the way back, he subdued Jerusalem. And that Jerusalem had been loyal to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And this happened in 605 BC. And it was the first but not the last encounter between Nebuchadnezzar and Jerusalem and Jehoiakim. So there would be 2 later invasions, one invasion 597, and then there was another one in 587, that was BC. And some say that this mention of the siege in Jerusalem in 605 BC is not mentioned in the book of Kings, so it didn't happen. And so here, the Jewish historian Josephus, he was a very famous writer at that time, quotes the Babylonian historian Berosus, who says that the biblical account of the 3 separate invasions of Jerusalem actually did happen. And that this specific attack is mentioned by Daniel, is documented by the Babylonian chronicles. This is a collection of tablets that were discovered in 1887, and they were kept in the British Museum. You can see them there today. So Nebuchadnezzar 605 BC presents a presence here in Judah is documented, and it is clarified in these tablets. So it did happen. There were 3 actual invasions of Jerusalem. So when the Babylonian Chronicles were finally published in 1956, they gave us first-rate detailed political and military information about the first 10 years of Nebuchadnezzar's life and in his reign as king. And excavations also document the victory of Nebuchadnezzar against the Egyptians at Carchemish. That was either in May or June of 605 BC. So archaeologists have found evidence of a battle. They found a lot of arrowheads here and layers of ash and the shield of a Greek mercenary who was fighting for the Egyptians. You know, when you had a war, you hired people from other countries to come help you, and this was a Greek person hired to fight for the Egyptians. Now, the campaign of Nebuchadnezzar was interrupted suddenly when he heard of the death of his father, and he had to go quickly back to Babylon so he could get himself on the throne. And he traveled 500 miles in 2 weeks, which was a very amazing short time to travel that far in that day. And so we know that the siege of Jerusalem in 605 was cut short because he had to go back to Babylon. Now, in verse 2, there is also no contradiction between Daniel, who said this happened in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, and Jeremiah 46:2, which said it was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. And so they're saying, well, there's a discrepancy here by Daniel. But what Daniel did was he used the king's years after the Babylonian method. And in that method, let's say the king went on his throne in the 2nd month of the year. That year was called the accession year. And then the 1st month of that next year would be the start of his 1st year of reign. Now, the Jewish people did it the different way. They said that if you went on the throne in the 2nd month, or even in the 11th month, say, that was still your 1st year of reign. It was not an accession year, and so that would make it a year more on the throne. So there is no contradiction there. So having spent most of his life in Babylon, it's only natural that Daniel should use the Babylonian form of chronology. In 597 BC, the deportation of Jehoiakim, Ezekiel, and others were taken away, and this deportation is described in 2 Kings 24. And it was prophesied in Isaiah 39:7. Bob, do you have that one? Bob, do you have Isaiah? Okay, would you read that, please?
And it says, if thy son that shall issue from thee, which thou hast begot, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon.
All right, this is a prophecy from Isaiah, and it leads some to think that Daniel and his companions were made eunuchs. Now, the Hebrew term seres was used of literal eunuchs, but the word derives from a phrase that simply means to be a servant of the king. So they're not sure if they were actually made eunuchs or if they were just called that because they were servants of the king. We don't know. The Lord gave Judah into the hands of the Babylonians for mainly 2 reasons. The first reason was that they were so steeped in idolatry, and the second reason was because they did not observe the Sabbath of the land. And those are both in Leviticus 25 and 26. So this shows us that the Lord always settles accounts with those who refuse to respond to his warnings. In the 587 BC invasion of the city of Jerusalem, then the city and the temple was destroyed, and that's in 2 Kings 25. Nebuchadnezzar did not take all of the furnishings of the temple, only some of them. And the remaining furnishings were either hidden before Nebuchadnezzar came or they were taken to Babylon at a later date. Now, the confiscation of these items from the temple and their deposit in the Babylonian temple was a dramatic declaration by Nebuchadnezzar, who said, "My God is better than your God, because I have the things from your temple." So God of Israel has to vindicate himself, right? So this is a low time for Judah and for God's people, and it seemed that the God of Israel lost out to the gods of Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon. Now, the book of Daniel shows God vindicating himself at a time when the conquest of Israel might have brought God's reputation into disgrace, saying, well, your God's just not very good. In verse 3 through 4, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. In verse 3, Nebuchadnezzar confiscated holy things from the temple, and he also took Judah's bright young men from the age of 15 maybe to 17 or 13 even. Nebuchadnezzar demonstrated that he was a very wise administrator and he was a very shrewd technician. And he just knew how to do things for his benefit. So taking these young men as hostages reminded the people back in Jerusalem that they should not revolt against the recently imposed Babylonian rule. In verse 5 through 7, and the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine that he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now, from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. And it was given that the Babylonian government here would provide for these young men everything that they needed: food, clothing, shelter, training, all of these things. And yet having the same food and wine prepared for them as was prepared for the king, that was supposed to be a very special honor that they got to eat with the king. Now, in the ancient world, much more than even now, I guess, there's a huge difference between what the very rich people ate and what the common people ate. And that may still be some truth in that today. But in Daniel 6 and 7, Daniel talks about these 4 youths and their new Babylonian names. Now, the name Daniel means God is my judge. And it was changed to Belteshazzar, meaning Bel's prince. Bel was one of the gods of Egypt. The name Hananiah, meaning beloved by the Lord, was changed to Shadrach, meaning illumined by the sun god. The name Mishael, meaning who is as God, was changed to Meshach, which may mean who is like Shach. And some believe this was a Babylonian goddess corresponding with Ishtar and Venus. So the name Azariah, meaning the Lord is my help, was changed to Abednego, meaning servant of Nego. So the purpose of the food, the names, education was simple. They wanted to indoctrinate these youths from the Hebrew culture and their God into their gods and their culture. That was what they wanted to do. So undoubtedly, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to communicate with these young men and give them everything that they needed so that they could just look to him. They didn't look to their God or anybody else. So Daniel and his friends refused, insisting that they would look to God. And Calvin wrote that Nebuchadnezzar knew that the Jews were stiff-necked and obstinate people, and I guess they still are, and that he used the sumptuous food to kind of soften up the captives, making them feel like they were really special. Now, today, Satan uses the same kind of strategy for believers. He wants to indoctrinate us into the world system. He wants us to identify or name ourselves in reference to the world. He wants us to free us from, feed us what the world wants us to know. And then he wants to educate us in the ways of the world. So he wants us to be of the world. The scripture says we should be in the world, but not of the world. Verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portions of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So this ancient Greek word defile means pollute or stain. And Daniel requested that he might not defile himself implies that he explained the spiritual basis for his request. He didn't make it seem that he didn't want the king's food for other reasons. So Daniel made it seem like he wanted to avoid the king's food. He didn't want to do that, but he wanted to make a case that he wanted what God wanted for him. And the only way to to go and be faithful is to be faithful in little things. If we're faithful in little things, then God will make us faithful in bigger things. And so Daniel made a big deal over this little thing. So why bring religion into it? Well, Daniel realized that his relationship with God touched every area of his life, and it included what he ate. So significantly, the root of sin goes back to eating forbidden food. And Daniel and his friends considered the king's food defiled for 3 different reasons. One, it definitely was not kosher. And the second, it was probably sacrificed to idols. And third, eating the king's food implied fellowship with their cultural system. Anytime you sat down with someone, that meant something. It was kind of like a covenant relationship. You sat and ate with them. And Daniel didn't object to the name that they gave him because he knew who he was. And others could call him whatever they wanted to. He was still Daniel. And he did not object to the Babylonian education because he knew what he believed. But he did object to the food from the king's table because eating it was in direct disobedience to God. So by Eastern standards, again, it is a covenant significance to eat with someone else at a table, and it was very significant. So God did not forbid the drinking of the wine, and nevertheless, in the pagan cultures, the wine, along with the meat, was sacrificed to the gods, their gods. And so it was why Daniel wanted to refuse it. So Daniel made a remarkably courageous decision here when we think about how hard it was to make this decision. First, the king ordered the menu, and if you refused what the king made as a menu, then you were rejecting the king. And the king, this could result in severe punishment. And then number 2, refusing the food might have branded them as being uncooperative, and it could have spoiled all of their chances for any kind of advancement. And yet many of the Hebrew youth who were brought to Babylon did eat the food that the king provided for them. The third reason was there was a real threat of punishment. Now, the ancient kings were well known for severe and sadistic punishment against anyone who crossed them. And Nebuchadnezzar was one who was capable of great cruelty. Number 4, the food itself was no doubt very attractive and seemed like a much better alternative to eating vegetables and drinking water for 3 years. So verse 5, mere distance made this a challenging issue also, because here they're separated from their friends and their family, and wouldn't it just be easy to go ahead and compromise and eat the king's food? Who would know? In verse 6, it was easy to think that God had let them down because he did allow them to be carried away as captive exiles, kidnapped from Jerusalem. So they may have said, well, why should we risk our neck for a God that let us down? And yet they were committed to obedience, even if God did not fulfill their expectations. So there are times that we have expectations of God, and those expectations are not fulfilled. And yet what we need to do is commit to the obedience of God anyway, because he has his own plans and his own ways. So in this, Daniel illustrated how to conquer a very difficult trial and glorify God before others in the midst of testing. So in the first part of verse 8, it said he was purposed in his heart. So he set his mind, made up his mind beforehand that he would not compromise. 2, life has to be positive. And Daniel found that if you're positive with everyone, especially your superiors, that was important. And verse number 3, protest must be courteous. Now, Daniel requested to be excused from the king's table, but he made it as a polite request, showing discretion. He didn't say, well, I'm not going to eat your food, or don't put me there. He didn't want to be obnoxious, and we should not be obnoxious when we are speaking about Jesus, making a stand for Jesus. In verse 9, Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. Now God did not abandon those who stood for him. Daniel entrusted himself to God, and God came through for them, though it was no doubt a stretching experience for Daniel and his friends. So God moved upon the authorities. That's how this all happened. So they regarded Daniel with goodwill, but God also worked through the wise actions of Daniel to cultivate that goodwill. And that's what we should have with people. We should have goodwill toward people. In verse 10 through 13, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacy, and see who is more fit. So deal with your servants. So here Daniel, in this verse 10, saw the situation through the steward's eyes and realized that the steward may get into trouble because he had legitimate concerns. And he wouldn't let the chief of the eunuchs pay the price for Daniel's conscience. So in it all, Daniel was willing to put himself in his faith into God for the test. And there was something so reasonable about Daniel's request and his approach that, he could have gone on a hunger strike. He could have done other things to not eat the king's food, but he just made that polite request. And he made it to the right person. And he said, put us to the test. Just test us and see. And if it's not good, okay, we'll go back to your way. Now, vegetables refers to all of the grains and the plants, not strictly just vegetables. And in verse 13, basically, this was a vegetarian diet, and it was chosen because the meat at the king's table was not prepared in a kosher way, and it was sacrificed to the idols, and the same thing with the wine. In verse 14 through 16, so he consented with them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter than all of the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. Some translations call it pulse. Does anybody have pulse in your translation? Gave them pulse to eat. Well, pulse is the seeds of wheat, barley, flour, beans, lentils, corn, or anything that's grown in the ground. Then they called it pulse. This was the hand of God at work. The chief of the eunuchs had all the power. His name, the steward's name was Melzar, and he had all the power in this situation. And Daniel and his friends seemed to be completely at his mercy. So we see here that God moved upon this steward, and he consented with them in this matter. And this was the hand of God at work, because there's no real biological reason that they should have been fatter and look better than the rest of them. Sure, it was full of protein, it was full of potassium and a lot of other minerals, but nothing to make them appear that much better. In verse 17 through 21, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all of the magicians and astrologers who were in all of his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus. So verse 17, this special intellectual ability of Daniel and his companions, it was not due to their diet, but it was due to the special intervention of the Lord. and some think that their diet did have a direct effect on their knowledge. Trapp says this: the slender diet was some help to their studies, for loaden bellies make leaden wits. In other words, if you have a full stomach and all your blood's gone to your stomach, your brains are kind of not working like they should be. So, nevertheless, the key was really certainly spiritual. And this shows that purity of heart and faithfulness to God comes before enlightenment in divine mysteries. So these young men from Jerusalem were immersed in the study of Babylonian culture, literature, and religion, and yet they remained faithful to God. So again, they were in Babylon, but they were not of Babylon. We are in the world, but we should not be of the world. And Daniel had a long, successful career, and it was really in the worst of circumstances for him. He worked for tyrants who thought nothing of killing anybody that was on the staff, or else he could just fire them. His employer suffered the worst kinds of hostile takeover from the Mede-Persian Empire when they conquered the Babylon Empire. And yet Daniel and his friends show us that an inner conviction can overcome any outward pressure, and that God-honoring convictions yield God-given rewards. So are there any questions or comments on this first chapter of Daniel? All right. We go to part 2, which are the visions of Nebuchadnezzar and their results. So in verse 1, now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. So it's difficult to understand when this actually happened. Was it during the time when Daniel was in training, or was it just after his 3-year course of training? But the ancient Babylonians spoke of the beginning and the end of their reign of their kings in a way that often overlapped years, so they just don't know. So the year 602 BC could have been the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and after 3 years of training for the youths of the Hebrew youths. But there was something disturbing about this dream of Nebuchadnezzar's, and he knew that it was unusually significant. In verse 2 through 9, then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. And so they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut to pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give you the interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. Verse 2. It's hard to say if Nebuchadnezzar really remembered the dream or not. He may have just remembered a part of it, but it may have been very vague in his mind, and we just really don't know. But he couldn't know for certain that the wise men could give him a correct interpretation of the dream. So he wanted to test their ability to tell what he dreamed as well as what it meant. Now, despite their protests, Nebuchadnezzar didn't ask too much of these magicians. After all, this is what they did for a living: the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans. And they were supposed to have the ability to contact their gods and get secrets from their gods from that spiritual realm. So if they were really what they claimed to be, then they should be able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was and then the interpretation. Now, this threat by Nebuchadnezzar and the method of execution that he described are both perfectly consistent with the character of ancient Eastern monarchs. They were very cruel. Archer described one method of dismemberment, and this is pretty bad. They would take 4 trees and they would tie them the tops, so they bend the tops over and tie them together of these 4 trees, all of them. And then they would the men were tied to each tree, one man to each tree, by one arm, the other arm, another leg, the other leg. And then the top rope was cut, and they were pulled apart into at least 4 pieces. I mean, they were just their arms and legs tore apart. So that was a horrible death, but that's one of the things that they used in that day. Now, this is the first mention of the Chaldeans as a class of soothsayers to the king. Critics take this as a mistake made only by a 2nd century BC writer would make, and critics suppose that in Daniel's day the term Chaldeans was just a racial term, saying, well, this is a certain race of people. And the linguistic research has demonstrated that the Babylonian word for an astrologer priest and their word for their supposed race was the same. So Daniel understood this because he used the term Chaldean in the racial term and also as a soothsayer. In verse 10 and 11, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth that can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." So verse 10, when the Chaldeans said this, they admitted that true revelation comes down to man from God. And they understood, maybe they didn't want to, but they understood that the revelation was not the achievement of man, but it had to come from God. So the strategy of these wise men was to convince the king that he was being unreasonable in his request, not that they were incompetent. So as far as these pagan magicians and astrologers and wise men, they knew that this was true. Verse 12 through 13, for this reason the king was angry and very furious and gave a command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So Nebuchadnezzar knew that false religion is worse than useless, and he knew that it was a curse, and he had no use for wise men that could not bring him the wisdom of God. And as a new king, he also perhaps used this situation to test how suitable these wise men were that were his father's old advisors. And this was a good way to get rid of them if they couldn't do what he wanted them to do. He could just clean house. In verse 14 through 16, then with counsel and wisdom Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. Verse 15, Daniel was obviously innocent in all of this, and yet he calmly dealt with this crisis. Now, in verse 16, Daniel knew that it takes time to listen to the Lord and to wait upon him. And Daniel was willing to take the time if the king would grant it. Now, for you and I, we sometimes ask God things, and we want him to tell us right now. Tell us now. I don't want to wait days and weeks or even longer for you to give me an answer. But it's important for us to give God time to give us that answer. We see it all through the scriptures. So verse 17 and 18, then Daniel went to his house, and he made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of the Babylonian. Verse 17, Daniel was in the type of situation here where only God could meet his need. And so he knew how important it was for him and his companions to pray. He had confidence in God that he could do a miracle here, but he also knew that prayers were very urgent. Now we know that Joseph interpreted dreams in the scriptures, but he never had to tell what the dream was first. He was always told the dream, and then he gave the interpretation. So this was even a harder situation here. In verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So this was not religion, this was revelation. God revealed it to him. And our commentator says, our job isn't to figure things out about God, but to understand what he has revealed to us. So it may have been a dream, it may have been a supernatural vision that happened at night. We're not sure. In verse 20 through 23, Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand. So here we see that Daniel praised God for his power and might, and he thought of how God is in command of all things. How God is mightier than any of the mighty kings like Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel was grateful that God had revealed to him this great knowledge, and he had the certainty of faith to believe that God gave him the answer even before he presented it before Nebuchadnezzar. He knew it was the answer. So our level of faith is often indicated by how long it takes us to start praising God. If we won't praise him until the answer is in hand, then we don't have much faith, says our commentator. So let me read that again. If we won't praise him until we have the answer, then we don't have much faith. So he's saying we need to praise God even before we get the answer. Verse 24 through 30. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, what will be in the latter days. Your dream and your visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, the secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes he made known the interpretation to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your heart. In verse 24, Arioch tried to glorify himself and Daniel for the answer to the king's dream, but Daniel refused to take the credit here, recognized that the credit went to God, and he revealed this dream to Daniel. So Nebuchadnezzar's dream didn't just concern himself for his kingdom, but the whole span of the future, which was to Nebuchadnezzar the latter days. And so we're going to stop here and to take the dream up next week. Are there any questions or comments on this chapter thus far? All right, we will see what the dream was and what its interpretation is next week.